We have Christian Downie joining us to infuse some energy and climate politics into our research seminars, which is always a good thing. So Christian is an associate professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the ANU. He is a DECRA fellow and was previously a VC's fellow at UNSW, which is no mean feat, and then spent time at MIT and LSE, amongst other institutions, as I understand it. Christian's also worked with a number of policy think tanks and as an advisor to a number of government agencies, including PMNC. And his research is widely published in outlets such as Regulation and Governance, Global Environmental Politics, Energy Policy, and Climate Policy. And his latest book is Business Battles in the US Energy Sector. So Lessons for a Clean Energy Transition, which I believe he'll be speaking about today. So that's all I need to say. Welcome to Christian. We're all really looking forward to your talk. I'll hand over to you for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we can move on to questions. So when you're ready, the floor, or the team's floor, whatever it is yours.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And let me start by thanking Ellie and Duncan McDonald for the invitation to speak today. It's a privilege to talk to you about my research, and hopefully in the Q&A have a chance to hear a little bit about the work that's being done at Griffith as well. So I'll jump right in so that we have plenty of time for discussion at the end. I hope everyone can see the slides, and just let me know if you can't. So as for those of you that follow climate and energy politics, you'll be well aware that the world is, let me just move this first slide. I hope you can see that slide now of a pie graph. The slides are moving okay. You'll be well aware that existing energy policies remain short of achieving the kind of energy revolution that we need. So despite the efforts of policymakers around the world, the energy sector continues to contribute about 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see on that slide, in 1973, about 80% of the total primary energy supply across the globe was met by fossil fuels, by gas, coal and oil, and you fast forward 40 years to 2017 and not much has changed. It's still 80% of the world's energy is met by fossil fuels. The interesting thing in that graph is if you could look at the top of the pie graph under 1973, you can see that that other is 0.1%. That's actually solar and wind. So despite this huge boom we've had in renewable energy, particularly solar and wind in recent years, it's still in 2017 only makes up less than 2% of total primary energy supply. I guess I put this graph up there. It's just one way to illustrate how far we have to go to decarbonise the energy sector across the globe. So if that's one illustration of the problem, the question then I guess that I've been fascinated about is what should policymakers do? And my background's political science and international relations, and so I've come at it from that point of view. Now, traditionally, we know that policymakers tend to favour measures that economists regard as efficient. So putting a price on carbon, whether it's a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme, because they're considered the most efficient way to reduce emissions. We also know, especially those of us that have lived in this country for a few years, that these types of policies aren't always successful. And here you can see a picture of a number of the coalition frontbenchers celebrating the abolition of the carbon price back in, I think it was 2014. I could put up pictures as well of Bill Clinton unsuccessfully putting in a form of carbon tax in 1992, of Europe doing the same in the early 90s, of President Obama failing to get an emissions trading scheme up in 2009. So we've seen a series of failures around the world, failed attempts to enact clean energy regulation. And as Ellie and I were just chatting about before I returned to academia in 2014, I saw firsthand the failure to entrench a carbon price in this country working in government. And I witnessed the lobbying from oil, gas, coal and other parts of the economy, but particularly those industries that will be most impacted by the scheme. And in recent years, there's been a growing literature across sociology, political science, energy transition studies and others that have looked at why do we see this succession of failures. And one of the reasons, and it's not the only part of the answer, but one part of the answer is the political resistance from incumbent fossil fuel industries. And it was was that, I guess, thought in my mind that in 2015, I moved to the US as part of a postdoc to look at the behavior of business actors in the US. The US seemed like an obvious place to go. Not only do we all know that it has enormous global influence, but of course it's also, and you can see it here, also the largest producer of oil and gas in the world and has the largest reserves of coal on the planet. And this graph just shows that over recent years, it's overtaken both Russia and Saudi Arabia to be the largest producer of oil and gas. I'll talk in a moment about some of the reasons why that's the case. So in 2015, I spent countless hours interviewing senior executives and lobbyists from all of the major fossil fuel industries, oil, gas and coal. Sat in the offices of lots of these major coal corporations and their industry associations in DC, as some of them explained to me the coalitions of business actors they were putting together to try and, undermine President Obama's attempts to limit emissions from coal. I also spent time down in Houston interviewing oil and gas executives and talking to their lobbyists in Capitol Hill, who were campaigning at that time to overturn a 40-year ban on the export of crude oil. I also spent some time talking to some of the smaller renewable companies and some of the larger ones with revenues in the billions of dollars that were looking to preserve tax subsidies. And the aim of these interviews was really to understand how and why business actors are shaping energy policy in the US, with the hope, with I guess my personal motivation, to understand what are some of the lessons for policymakers, given my experience in government as well. So this afternoon, I really just want to do two things. One is to talk very briefly, as you can see in this outline, just about some of those business battles. There's a lot of detail about them, but I just want to skim over them to give you some background, and then spend most of my remaining time talking about the three lessons for policymakers, or at least as I saw them. So let me talk a little bit about these business battles. In order to examine business behavior in the US, I concentrated on 6 contemporary policy contests that took place during the Obama administration. So they're all contests at the federal level, 2 each in the oil and gas industries, 2 in the coal and utilities, and 2 in the renewable industries. And as you can see here on this slide, these are just some of the key actors. So my focus was business. I wasn't looking at civil society or NGOs or others. And so you can see there in the left-hand column, or the middle column, I should say, some of the key firms in each of those industries. In my work and articles, I explain the methods around how these were selected. But for example, those coal producers, I looked at the top 20 producers based on their annual production. And then in the far right column, you can see some of their industry associations, which, as I discuss in the book, played a key role in coordinating some of these coalitions that were used to shape energy policy. And so some of these, like the Edison Electric Institute, which represents utilities, was particularly influential. And here are the 6 policy contests. So let me just talk very briefly about them. The first set was on the oil and gas industry. And as you saw in that earlier slide, the US has had this huge increase in oil and gas production. The reason, and most of you will have likely heard this phrase, the fracking revolution, but essentially it refers to these new technology breakthroughs that happened, which enabled US producers to access onshore oil and gas reserves. Before that, the focus had really been on big offshore projects, but the fracking revolution enabled US oil and gas producers to access these huge reserves. At the time, the US had in place, actually for 40 years, a ban on the export of crude oil. So basically, if you produced oil in the US, you had to consume it in the US. And what happened is, with the fracking revolution and this shale oil boom, because of that export ban, there was a price spread between what the price of oil and gas was at home in the US and what it was internationally. And many of these big companies that I mentioned and their industry associations were pretty keen to overturn this ban in Congress so that they could access higher prices on international markets. So we saw this big battle between not only oil and gas producers and Congress, but also others in the supply chain, such as petrochemical manufacturers and oil refiners that were benefiting from these lower domestic prices. So I was quite interested in exploring some of the divisions along the supply chain or within and between these industries. The second set of contests I focused on was the coal and utilities sector. That's the middle two rows there. The first one was President Obama in his first term of office tried to implement an emissions trading scheme, largely targeting emissions from the coal sector. He was unsuccessful in that, in part because of the behaviour of some of these business actors. So in his second term, he had a second go at it, this time using regulations rather than legislation, in part to avoid some of the political pitfalls he'd experienced in his first term. And so he implemented what was called the Clean Power Plan, and basically the EPA was asked to establish pollution standards on power plants with a view to reduce emissions by about 30% by 2030. Again, the business community and others were largely successful in delaying that implementation, or at least frustrating it until, of course, President Trump came in and stopped it altogether. But again, the interesting thing in there is and I can talk about this more in Q&A, but across those industries, there was differing preferences. So some industries, such as the utility industry or parts of the utility industry, supported President Obama initiatives. Some other utilities did not, and coal producers almost uniformly opposed. So we saw, again, some battles within and between industries. The last set of contests I looked at was my aim was to look at the renewable industries, and I focused on two. The first was the wind industry. The wind industry benefited from what's called production tax credits. There's a lot of detail in here, but essentially there are these tax credits that they get for about $23 per megawatt hour, at least in 2015. The issue at the time was that these tax credits had a sunset clause and they were going to expire, and it was almost identical for the solar industry with their tax credit, and the renewable industry needed Congress to extend them. And interestingly, despite a Republican-controlled Congress at the time, they were successful. So if people are interested in any of those particular contests or issues, happy to talk further about them. But what I want to do now is really go into what I learnt from them. Of course, what I should say is that they are kind of fascinating in their own right. So there are papers that I've never had a chance to write, but around, why did the US succeed in overturning a 40-year ban on oil that had been in place, I think, since the Carter or Nixon administrations? What role did business play in there? Or why were solar companies able to achieve an extension of their tax credits despite these Republican-controlled Congress? So the policy contests themselves are quite fascinating, but let me turn now to the policy lessons, because that's what I wanted to focus the talk on today. And there's three that came out to me, and I'm sure these aren't the only ones. The first lesson I took out of this is the need to entrench and build existing interests. So what I mean by that? Well, governments need to think about building interests in support of clean energy. Targeted policies such as solar subsidies or tax credits or rebates to households both boost the industry and build a political constituency in support of solar power. So, for example, these investment tax credits for solar in the US helped drive a boom in the solar industry, and an industry that was measured in the millions of dollars quickly became measured in the billions of dollars. The important point, I guess, from the political perspective is that as the industry revenues increased, so too did the lobbying presence of these industries. And so we saw groups like the Solar Energy Industries Association become a vocal advocate for clean energy in Washington, just as the Solar Council has here in Australia. We also see new groups emerge as the solar industry grew. So, for example, in 2013, former Republican Congressman Barry Goldwater Jr., who became a chairman of a group called TUSC, which was aptly named Tell Utilities Solar Won't Be Killed. And these guys essentially fought running battles at a state level to try and deal with utilities that were trying to kill off solar with particular regulations. But what these groups did is they helped to offset the tide of fossil fuel lobbying that regularly washes across the shores of government in most democracies. So that was the first lesson. The second, and I'll spend a bit more time on this one, is thinking about how you can implement policies that exploit divisions between and within industries. So we know from decades of research in political science, in sociology, in business and management, that firms' preferences will be a function essentially of two things, of their commercial interests, but also a range of what some people refer to as institutional factors. That might be the history of the firm, the culture of the firm, their experience with particular technologies. As firms follow their preferences, energy corporations, for example, they invariably become entangled in inter-industry conflicts. And my view was that these could be exploited by smart policies. So to give you a really crude example for the purposes of just to illustrate, if the aim of a government was to regulate coal, policies might be more likely to succeed if they exploit the natural divisions between coal producers that mine the coal and electric utilities further down the supply chain that burn it to generate electricity, because they have quite different commercial interests. Or if the aim is to regulate oil, there are natural divisions between oil producers and oil refiners who have very different commercial interests. And these splits played out on a number of occasions in the policy contests I was looking at. The other thing to note here is that when you're thinking about exploiting divisions between industries, the kind of intuitively, it makes sense to target a weaker industry because they'll be less able to mount a resistance campaign. Now in the US, the obvious example is the coal industry. I always like this statistic just because when I first came across it, it was so startling to me. But the US coal industry is in structural decline. And as you can see there on that slide, in 2015, between 2012 and 2015, more than 50 firms representing 50% of US coal production filed for bankruptcy, including 3 of the largest, Peabody Energy and others. And I guess as an aside, their commercial situation hasn't got much better during the Trump years either. The point is that as coal has declined, so has their lobbying presence, and a number of their key industry associations have wound back or at least reduced their lobbying presence in DC. So for example, if you look at the years between 2014 and 2015 during the contest over President Obama's Clean Power Plan, the US coal industry spent an estimated $18 million on lobbying, a large sum by any measure, but one dwarfed by the utility industry, which spent $240 million. So the utility industry during that period is spending 13 times what the coal industry is on lobbying. And so if you're thinking about which industry is going to be less able to resist a policy, and when you're targeting coal, clearly it's going to be the coal industry over the utility industry. And when I met with lobbyists in DC, who openly conceded that working for the coal industry was drying up because firms simply didn't have the revenue to fund the same number of lobbyists as they had 5 years ago. And that was actually quite a repeated point that many of these guys, and most of the lobbyists were making. If you're worried about these lobbyists, don't be. Many of them were quite successful in moving their operations over to pharmaceuticals or defence industries as well. So lobbying firms still seem to be thriving in DC. The third part about this is thinking not only about divisions between industries, but also within industries, and by targeting outliers. So what do I mean by an outlier? By an outlier, I mean a corporation that has taken a preference which is different to the rest of the industry. So let me give you an example. In the US, I looked at the top 20 coal producers, and they uniformly were opposed both to Obama's attempt at emissions trading, but also his attempt to implement a clean power plan. There was one exception among that 20, and that was Rio Tinto, a major coal producer, but in both cases it supported Obama's regulatory initiatives. And again, I'm happy to talk about why that was later if it's of interest. But policymakers who target these corporations, especially when they're powerful actors, such as Rio Tinto, they might be able to bring them on board to support a policy that the rest of the industry opposes, giving them some political cover. At the same time, if you encourage an outlier like Rio to withdraw from a key industry association, you reduce the financial resources of that industry association, but you also reduce the political legitimacy of the coalition. And if you're fortunate, you might actually see a cascade of withdrawals from a particular industry association. And we've seen this approach done by activists here in Australia. You can see these are just some headlines from a few years ago where activists were targeting Rio and BHP and trying to push them to withdraw from particular groups such as the Minerals Council of Australia, which has obviously played a key role in shaping climate and energy policy in this country. And they've had some success in pursuing this strategy. With BHP in particular, for example, calling on the Minerals Council to take a slightly different approach when it comes to coal. And Rio too. And again, in part, this is driven by their commercial interests because these companies themselves have been divesting from their coal assets to some extent. I mean, the other point to make here, of course, is that any action to phase out specific industries must involve policies for a just transition for workers who are too often left exposed when corporations go bankrupt, like we saw in the US, and when entitlements are left unpaid. And there's a number of colleagues in the US, here at ANU that are working on some of those just transition issues. The third point I want to make is that policymakers shouldn't only seek to entrench and build existing commercial interests. They shouldn't only think about exploiting divisions, but also think about how you can shift commercial interests. And I'd argue that right now this is perhaps especially important in Australia. Policy signals need to think about how they can induce significant changes in industry's investment and structure. So a good example in the US and here, I guess to some extent, is what Americans refer to as renewable portfolio standards, or what we call renewable energy targets. Most of you will be familiar with a renewable energy target. Essentially, it's compelling utilities to invest in renewable energy to generate, a certain percentage of their power from renewables. But what this does is it shifts their commercial interest towards policies that support renewable energy rather than fossil fuels, because they're being forced to invest in renewable assets and divest of fossil fuel assets. So their commercial interest is shifting. Renewable energy targets is one example. Another might be financial disclosure guidelines. There was a piece published in Science, I think it was in 2019, which pointed out that relatively modest financial disclosure guidelines regarding climate change risks could cause a substantial repricing of fossil fuel assets. In other words, fossil fuel reserves might be downgraded on the books. Now, this in turn, of course, if their assets are repriced downwards, makes it harder for the oil and gas sector, for example, to develop new oil fields, preventing further investment in oil and gas infrastructure. And the more we limit new investment in offshore oil wells, gas wells and pipelines, the lower the political, economic and social costs are going to be of transforming the energy sector going forward. And of course, the other thing is the lower the likelihood of stranded assets. And we're seeing financial regulators in Australia paying particular attention to that now. And of course, we've seen G20 countries move ahead with carbon financial disclosure guidelines, and APRA and Assoc, I think, are taking a bigger role in this place. So financial disclosure guidelines are another example of how policies could shift existing interests. Before I conclude, I think it's worthwhile emphasising how this can play a role in Australia, because I think there's a lot of potential for that in Australia right now. We've got some of the best renewable energy resources in the world. Many of you will have seen the books by Professor Ross Garnaut and other commentators talking about the potential for Australia to be a renewable energy superpower. But to do that, it's going to take government policies that support new clean energy industries and policies that shift existing interests. So take the aluminium smelters down in Victoria, which are very emissions intensive. With the right government policies, we can help them to move from expensive, dirty energy to cheaper renewable energy. Now, such policies are going to have obvious economic gains if Australia becomes a preferred destination for energy-intensive manufacturing fueled by clean energy. But a point I want to make is that they'll also have political gains, because as these industries become supporters of clean energy, they're not going to be opponents of new measures to deal with climate change, or not to the same degree. So I'll leave it there, so that we have plenty of time for questions. I really just, that's my last slide, but I really just wanted to give you some food for thought, I guess, about how we might design and how we might sequence policies to transition the energy sector. So that is to entrench and build existing interests, to exploit divisions between and within industries to limit political opposition, and as I was just saying, to think about how you can design policies that might shift interests over time, such as financial disclosure guidelines. Now, of course, I'm not saying any of this will be easy, but I think with political momentum building, in many capitals, and the likelihood that here in Australia we're going to face renewed pressure to act following Biden's victory. Governments aren't only going to need to act urgently, but they're also going to need to act in ways that win the political debate. If you're after more information, there's a book and a few articles that came out of this project, which delve deeper into some of the theoretical debates in the literature, and there's much more detail on the case studies. But thank you very much for tuning in, and thank you, Ellie and Duncan, for having me. And happy to answer questions on this or broader global climate energy politics as well. Thank you.